If you're a sober driver who thinks you've got nothing to worry about during a traffic stop, this might be the most important video you've watched all year. This video is sponsored by SimpliSafe. There's no safe like SimpliSafe. In just 5 minutes, you could go from completely innocent to handcuffed on the side of the road, your job is on the line, and your mugshot is plastered everywhere, all because a cop thinks you might be buzzed. Today, I'm breaking down 5 favorite tricks cops love to use that can trap even stone cold sober people, and what you can do to shut them down before they ruin your life. Trick number 1. If you're sober, you've got nothing to worry about. Just take these quick tests. This, my friend, is a lie. To believe somehow that field sobriety tests are both neutral and fair. In reality, they're designed to make you fail. Imagine for a moment being asked to walk a tightrope. In the dark, on gravel, with sirens blazing and flashlights in your face. That's exactly what these tests feel like. Even the government admits that these tests can be flawed. The eye test, better known as the HGN test, is only 77% accurate, but that's only in the most ideal of conditions. The walk and turn test, 68% accurate. The one-leg stand test, 65%. That's a 1 in 3 chance of failing these tests even when you're stone cold sober. Maybe you say, well, Jeff, those percentages don't sound too bad. Well, add to the fact that in addition to actually coming up with those scores, it's all based on one thing, the officer's opinion. The same officer who pulled you over and likely already believes you're intoxicated. So what if you sway just a tad bit? Maybe you pause when he asks a question. Or maybe you flinch when he gets close to you. Boom, you have failed. Take the case of Taven Galanakis, pulled over in Iowa, and he was stone cold sober. I mean, he blew 0.00. Still, the cops said he failed the test and arrested him anyway. The crazy part is the body camera footage showed that Galanakis was completely sober. In fact, they then test him and he has a 0.00, but the cops will not take the evidence they're receiving. They decide to disregard it and arrest him anyway. This innocent man was then arrested and brought in for drug testing, which he also passed. It took a federal judge to finally call out this insanity. Judge Stephen Locher ruled that a jury could have reasonably found that the officer had violated Galanakis' rights. In fact, he said, and I quote, Galanakis' speech and movements were not even remotely consistent with someone under the influence. The judge noticed how ridiculous it was that the teen was the one that was begging for the breath test, yet the officers were clearly ignoring his signs of sobriety. This case clearly shows how a sober person can cooperate and even take some of these tests and still be arrested because of these bogus field sobriety tests. But wait a minute, what if you actually want to take these tests to try to prove that you're not intoxicated? In Ohio, the Supreme Court case of State versus Homan threw out field sobriety tests that where the officers did not exactly follow strict protocol, acknowledging that if cops don't actually follow the rules and the training they were given for these tests, they're essentially worthless evidence. Oh, and if you think that actually taking these field sobriety tests will help show what your actual blood alcohol level is, think again. Multiple courts all over this country have ruled that you cannot take field sobriety tests and correlate them to a specific breath or blood alcohol level, and attempting to do so is just junk science. So being sober, it's not enough. These tests are absolutely a trap, and the best way to deal with them is to not take them at all. In fact, in most states, DWI sobriety tests are completely voluntary. So you can look at the officer right in the face and say, Officer, I will not answer any further questions, and I refuse to provide any other information without my lawyer present. 1 in 3 sober people fail these tests, and we're calling this justice. And if you think that's the worst of it, just wait and see how these tests are used to convict people in court. That brings us to trick number 2. Failing these tests proves that you're drunk. Now, cops and prosecutors love this lie. They love to say that failing these tests by itself shows you must be intoxicated. They'll say something like, the defendant exhibited all 6 clues, clearly showing impairment. Sounds scientific, right? But here's the real truth. These tests were only ever designed to establish probable cause, not proof that you're actually intoxicated. In fact, in the National Highway Traffic and Safety Administration manual, the exact manual that cops are trained on this DWI detection, they have a disclaimer in that manual that says, and I quote, field sobriety tests are indicators, not proof of intoxication. And the clues these cops are looking for, Completely arbitrary. Miss heeled a toe by half an inch? Clue. Pause for just a second? Clue. Raise your arm slightly? Clue. 2 clues? You failed. Taking these DWI tests is like getting a pop quiz from your teacher, and midway through the quiz, the teacher decides which answers are wrong, and she doesn't tell you the rules for the test until after you've taken it. Here's the scientific reality. Peer-reviewed researchers have placed a real challenge on the reliability of these field sobriety tests. One study found that these tests barely improve the officer's guess as to whether you're intoxicated. Another study determined that there was a sizable number of false arrests because of the bias of the officer and how they administered the tests. These tests aren't always science, and they're many times just a show, and you don't have to play along. But what happens when the cop pressures you to blow and says it'll only get worse if you don't? This brings us to trick number 3. Refusing the breath test will only make it worse. Now, this trick is all about intimidation. The officer will look at you and say, if you refuse this test, you'll lose your license for a year. Just blow, it'll be easier. This brings us to implied consent laws. All 50 states in our country provide implied consent laws that say if you operate a motor vehicle on a public roadway and you have a valid license, you are impliedly consenting to provide a sample of your breath, blood, or urine after a valid DWI arrest. Now, if you refuse, there can be administrative penalties like license suspensions. However, cops can sometimes oversell these consequences in the heat of the moment in order to get you to blow. They have a tendency to read over the statutory warning form very quickly and then try to make you feel like you have no other choice other than to provide a sample right now. Here's how it typically works. If you provide a breath test and you fail, you will receive a driver's license suspension. Now, because you submitted to the breath test, it's typically shorter, usually around 90 days in most states. If you refuse, it is possible the suspension can be longer, anywhere between 6 months to a year, depending on your state. Yes, that's a tough penalty, but remember, you can still get what's called an occupational driver's license that allows you to drive, even if you received this administrative license suspension. And after all, which is worse? A temporary suspension where you're still able to drive around, or submitting to a breath test that could be defective, that could then be used in court to try to prove you were intoxicated. Now you could be facing a DWI conviction, a loss of your job, a big increase in fines from the state, and an increase in your insurance premiums. But how does the court actually handle a refusal? It depends on your state. Some states, like Arizona and Texas, allow the prosecutor to stand up and use your refusal as evidence of somehow of your guilt because you didn't cooperate with the state. But in contrast, some states like Georgia, which ruled in 2019 in the case of Elliott versus State that, quote, using a defendant's refusal against him in court violates the Georgia's constitutional ban on self-incrimination. So on one side, you have a possible license suspension, but on the other side, if you give the cops what they want, they could give you a test that even could be defective that shows maybe somehow you were intoxicated and you might end up convicted. So be prepared for the cops in the heat of the moment to say, I need you to provide a breath test now. I'm going to put this breathalyzer up to your mouth. If you refuse to take it, I can suspend your license. It might even involve an additional charge, and it will just go easier for you if you go ahead and cooperate. But here's the secret the cop won't tell you when he wants you to give a breath test. You're already under arrest. You know that if you were to give the breath test and blow all zeros, do everything the officer said, you're still going to jail, you're still arrested, it won't help you one bit. You'll still have to post bond, you'll still have to go to court. Why? Because under most states, there's 3 ways to prove intoxication. One is to have a blood alcohol level of 0.08 or higher at the time of driving. The other is to have a loss of the normal use of your mental faculties because of alcohol or drugs, or have a loss of the normal use of your physical faculties because of alcohol or drugs. So if you cooperate and you give them a breath test where you blow all zeros, they'll say that you must have still been intoxicated in some way and not had the normal use of your mental or physical faculties. So you can't win for trying. This video is sponsored by Simply Safe. Guys, if you follow this channel, you already know how important your rights and your privacy is. especially from the government and the police. I've always told you, document every interaction with the police. But what about protecting your home for ever getting to that point? I recently partnered with SimpliSafe because their Active Guard outdoor protection system takes home security to the next level. Traditional alarms only sound after someone's broken into your home. But then the damage, emotional and financial, is already done. SimpliSafe's new system stops intruders before they ever get inside. With advanced AI technology, SimpliSafe recognizes the friendly faces, your friends, your family, maybe your neighbors and your dog walker, and instead, it focuses in on suspicious activity. Their live monitoring agents react in real time, speaking directly to trespassers, triggering spotlights and sirens, or dispatching police immediately. Let me tell you, knowing someone is actively protecting my family before trouble hits provides real peace of mind. I protect my home with SimpliSafe, and I can promise you, you will not regret in investing in your security. I've teamed up with SimpliSafe to offer you an exclusive 50% discount on your new security system. And your first month of professional monitoring is free, but you have to act fast. Go to simplisafe.com/HamptonLaw to customize your protection today. And hey, if you don't love it, return it within 60 days for a full refund. Because guys, there's no safe like SimpliSafe. Protect yourself and your privacy. Go to simplisafe.com/HamptonLaw today. But wait, is there a big difference between refusing a breath test versus a blood test? In the U.S. Supreme Court case of Birchfield versus North Dakota, the Supreme Court ruled that the police cannot make you take a breath test, even though they can potentially suspend your license and create some administrative fines. However, when it comes to a blood test, if you refuse the blood test, the only recourse is for the officer to draft up an actual search warrant with an accompanying affidavit where they will have to establish enough proof, probable cause, where a judge will sign off on that warrant, and then they can actually force you to give a blood draw. So where does that leave us? On one hand, you can try to cooperate, and you're going to provide a breath sample that can be used against you. And if that breath sample was wrong, by the way, you'll find many of these breathalyzers are wrong, and we'll show you that in a moment, then that can now be used against you in court. And it's like handing the bullet to the prosecutor to use against you. On the other hand, if you refuse, you have the opportunity to force this officer to prove that you were intoxicated through what he observes, even if you have to possibly face a license suspension in your state. Now I'm going to tell you something about breath tests that will probably change the way you look at all of this. A New York Times investigation came out showing that thousands, tens of thousands of breath test results were shown to be as much as 40% higher than the actual reading when it came to alcohol. In fact, judges in New Jersey and Massachusetts had to throw out over 30,000 DWI cases because they found out that a lot of these machines were either calibrated wrong or it was improperly given to the individual and the results were bogus. Why would you trust your fate to an unreliable box? So, when the cop comes to you, starts trying to shove that breath test instrument into your mouth, you can say, "Officer, at this time, I refuse to provide any breath tests unless my lawyer is present." And if the officer starts trying to sweet talk you by saying, "Hey, this will only go easier for you if you play along. Remember, you're already under arrest. No matter what you do, you're going to jail, and no good deed goes unpunished. If you provide a sample of your breath, it will be used against you, and like the example I gave earlier, they may then also try to go get a blood draw because they believe you're already drunk to begin with." So what have we learned so far? DWI sobriety tests? Unreliable. Failing these tests proves nothing, and giving an actual breath test could actually hurt you much more than ever help you. Now let's talk about the next trap, the trap that gets people in trouble with DWI more than any other trap, opening their mouth when they don't have to. I call this trick the casual conversation trap. It's interesting. Cops are all businesslike when you're on the side of the road doing all these tests, but as soon as you're under arrest, it's very typical that you will see an officer start to become your best friend. They'll ask all types of casual questions. "Well, where were you headed from tonight?" "Oh, you were hanging out at that bar? That's a pretty cool place. How much did you have to drink?" Who all were you hanging out with? What did you have to eat tonight? You think it's just casual conversation, but it's not. The officer is trained to get you to relax and start talking. Because if you'll start answering his questions just thinking, hey, I'm trying to break the tension and I'm hoping I'll get out of here quicker, remember, he's asking you a lot of these questions strategically to volunteer information that can be used later to try to extrapolate back in time and prove that you were intoxicated at the time of driving. Remember, what you say can cost you your case. Silence, it never hurts you. Talking, it can actually bury you. When the officer starts asking you all these casual questions, you can be polite, but you can look at him and say, Officer, I exercise my right to remain silent, and I will not answer any questions unless my lawyer is present. It's magic words. It's both the Fifth Amendment and the Sixth Amendment rights that you have under our Constitution, and at that point, it shuts the officer down. Now, just when you think the worst is over, the cops look at you and say, hey, I need a blood draw, and don't fight the science. The final lie and trick is that breath tests and blood tests are flawless. They are not. Machines fail. Labs, they mess up. Calibrations on instruments sometimes drift. Storage can be botched. I just covered a moment ago the New York Times story about all of those tests that were more than 40% higher on their readings than what was actually legitimate. And you know why that was the case? Because the government is really bad at managing and maintaining the things they have, including DWI testing. Imagine trusting a thermometer that hasn't been calibrated in 5 years, and based on that result, it will determine if you go to jail. In Massachusetts alone, over 27,000 breath tests were thrown out in court because it was found that many of the calibration results were falsified. Think about that. Falsified. That's not a glitch. That's an all-out scandal. You say, okay, Jeff, I get it. I should refuse a breath test. But what if the police turn around and force a blood draw from you with a warrant? First, you need to recognize that test results can be challenged, and many DWI cases are won that way. But secondly, and more importantly, blood tests have their own vulnerabilities. Literally, from the beginning to the end, the entire process is rife with potential errors that you can challenge. For example, the moment your blood is taken, your blood must be stored, transported, analyzed, reported, and there can be errors, which happen all the time along the way. One of the most common areas we see is if the actual blood is not drawn properly, it can actually be contaminated, and it's bogus. Did they use an alcohol swab on your skin before drawing? It's alcohol on your skin. What if it was an officer taking the blood and not an actual licensed technician, which is required in most states? What if the officers took forever before the blood was drawn? We've seen cases take up to 6 hours before the officer does a blood draw. The longer in time it takes to take the blood, the less reliable the blood draw is in court. And once they take the blood from your arm, it needs to immediately be refrigerated. What if they leave it in the mailroom or sit in a hot squad car? This is known scientifically to create what's called fermentation. And what do you think fermentation does? I mean, that's where we get our beer from. When something ferments, you see a higher level of alcohol. In one forensic study, it determined that improper storage by the police and the labs can account for an actual alcohol reading 100% or more higher than the original reading, which means it's possible that an actual blood alcohol sample could be taken from, a blood sample could be taken from your arm, and yet it was going to read nothing, but because it sat there and fermented, now it actually has a blood alcohol level. Another area, what about chain of custody? How do we know how the blood got from your arm to the actual courtroom? And how do we know the lab handled it properly? Here's a crazy example. In one Texas case, a police department sent a blood sample to the wrong person instead of the actual lab to do the testing. Imagine that. If the police department would mail the sample to the wrong address, what else could possibly go wrong? Finally, in crime labs, human error and misconduct happens all the time. Not to mention there have been countless scandals involving crime labs. We've seen examples of lab techs doing what they call dry labbing, which are fake results, mislabeling samples, using expired reagents. Even something as simple as improper pivoting can throw off the result. Unlike breath tests, which are immediate, blood tests can take weeks or months to process. And if you see some of these lab techs that are actually doing the testing in big batches, if they get confused or they get off task, you can come up with terrible results and people's lives are hanging in the balance. So if you are forced to take a blood test in order to protect yourself and stop cops and prosecutors from using potentially tainted evidence against you, here are some things you need to make sure you get lined up. Number one, you need to make sure you subpoena maintenance logs, chain of custody records, even demand an independent blood test. Never assume it's over just because you see a number on a sheet. So as you can see, you don't have to be drunk to get trapped by a DWI stop. You don't have to do the cops test, you don't have to prove you're innocent on the roadside, and you certainly don't have to talk yourself into a conviction. The cop has his badge, he has his flashlight, and he has his script. But you have your rights. Know your rights. Stand up for your rights. Don't let the officer trick you on the roadside, and you will protect yourself if you end up having to go to court. Now, we just covered how to stop cops from tricking you during a DWI stop. But what if your car was parked? What if you were sleeping it off? Did you know cops have more tricks up their sleeve? Check out this next video where I show you the 5 new tricks cops are using during DWI stops. See you over there.